The silence was a pressure, a physical weight against the skin. It was the first thing he knew each cycle, before the lumen panels overhead simulated dawn with a slow, sterile wash of blue-white light. He was subject 734, and the silence was his cradle and his cage. It was composed of the thrum of the atmospheric recyclers, the faint electronic whine of the containment field that lined his chamber's invisible walls, and the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears, a frantic, tidal rhythm that was the only part of him that still felt truly alive. He lay on a slab of polished composite, cool and unyielding against his spine, the thin grey tunic he wore doing little to soften its unforgiving surface. He did not need comfort. Comfort bred weakness, and weakness was a flaw in the design. Director Valerius had taught him that. The light intensified, bleaching the last shadows from the corners of the room, rendering everything in stark monochrome. White walls, white floor, white ceiling. A perfect, seamless cube of absolute control. He rose, the movement fluid and precise, a testament to years of neuromuscular conditioning. His feet made no sound on the floor. He was a ghost in his own life, a phantom haunting the sterile machine that was his world. He moved to the center of the chamber, assumed the meditative posture, and closed his eyes. His purpose was to feel, but not for himself. He was a sensor, an instrument of exquisite sensitivity, designed to perceive the turbulent currents of emotion that roiled beneath the placid surface of the Synarch Directorate's ordered society. He would extend his consciousness, a delicate, probing filament of awareness, and listen to the silent screams, the hidden joys, the festering resentments of the city's millions. He was the Directorate's confessor, its early warning system, its most secret and effective weapon. He was not a person. He was an asset. The morning ritual began. A soft chime and a panel in the wall slid open, revealing a nutrient paste, grey and odorless. He consumed it without thought, its texture uniform, its temperature controlled to the 10th of a degree. Sustenance without pleasure, efficiency. He drank a measured amount of purified water, hydration without satisfaction. The panel closed. Another chime, and the air thickened with the scent of aerosolized chemicals, the daily regimen of suppressants that kept his own emotional responses muted, his hormonal systems in a state of placid neutrality. They made the silence inside him match the silence of the room. He breathed it in, a familiar, clinical sting in his sinuses. It was the scent of his own negation. Today was different. The director's voice, a calm, disembodied baritone, filled the chamber, emanating from the walls themselves. Subject 734. Prepare for designation. A diplomatic delegation from the Ethelgard Imperium arrives at Joe 900 Standard. You will serve as an empathic adjunct. The Ethelgard Imperium. The name was a discordant note in the sterile symphony of his existence. He had filtered their collective consciousness from a distance, a chaotic storm of primal emotions, of fierce loyalties and untamed ambitions. They were everything the Directorate was not: organic, unpredictable, steeped in tradition and instinct. They were the past, a relic the Synarchs sought to manage, contain, and eventually erase. You will monitor the primary, Prince Rhys of the House of Ethel, gauge his intent, his sincerity, his vulnerabilities. You will be a lens, nothing more. Do you understand? A lens, a piece of polished glass. He did not speak. He did not need to. His compliance was a fundamental parameter of his existence. He inclined his head a fraction of an inch, a gesture of assent so minimal it was almost imperceptible. the director would perceive it. He perceived everything. "Your dampeners will be set to minimal tolerance," the voice continued, a hint of something that might have been warning, or perhaps even a perverse scientific curiosity coloring its perfect modulation. "We require maximum sensitivity. There may be feedback. Do not allow it to compromise your function." Feedback. He understood the term. It was the system's word for pain, for the agony of unfiltered emotion crashing against his carefully constructed defenses. It was a risk the director was willing to take. He was an asset, and assets were expendable if the data they yielded was valuable enough. The lumen panels brightened to their full clinical intensity. A section of the wall dissolved, revealing a transit corridor. 2 civic protectors, their faces obscured by mirrored helmets, stood waiting. They were monoliths in grey armor, their presence a silent assertion of the Directorate's power. They did not look at him. They looked through him, at the space he occupied. He walked between them, his bare feet cold on the metallic floor of the corridor. He was being moved from his cage to another, larger one. The world outside his chamber was a series of white hallways, maglev tubes that hummed with silent speed, and vast, empty atriums designed to awe and intimidate. There were no crowds, no clutter, no life, only the clean, efficient hum of the machine. They arrived at the summit chamber. It was a cavernous space, dominated by a circular table of black obsidian. One half of the room was lined with the grey-clad figures of the Synarch Directorate, their faces impassive, their postures rigid. The other half was empty, waiting. He was positioned behind and to the right of Director Valerius's chair, a living statue intended to be overlooked. He closed his eyes, steadying his breathing, preparing himself for the storm. He could feel it already, a distant pressure building against his senses, the raw, unshielded consciousness of the approaching Imperials. It was like the feeling of an approaching thunderstorm, the air growing heavy and electric. The doors at the far end of the chamber hissed open. The Ethelgard delegation entered, and it was as if a vibrant, chaotic slash of colour had been torn across a sterile white canvas. They wore deep blues and crimsons, their uniforms adorned with metals that gleamed under the cold lights. They moved with a predatory grace, their presence filling the room, pushing back against the oppressive silence. And at their head was the prince, Rhys of Ethel. The moment he stepped into the chamber, Kaelin's world fractured. It was not a thought. It was not a feeling. It was a physical impact, a seismic shock that bypassed every suppressor, every layer of conditioning, every wall he had ever built. A wave of something crashed into him. The scent of ozone after a lightning strike, the mineral tang of rain on dry earth, the deep, resonant warmth of a fire in a winter forest. Colour exploded behind his eyelids, a blue so deep it was almost black, the colour of a midnight sky, shot through with flecks of molten gold. A sound, a single, resonant chord that vibrated in the marrow of his bones, shaking loose years of cultivated numbness. His breath hitched, his heart, that steady metronomic muscle, slammed against his ribs with a frantic alien rhythm. He was malfunctioning. This was feedback, catastrophic system failure. He fought to regain control, to push the sensory data into neat clinical boxes, to analyze and report. But it was not data. It was him, the prince. He looked up, his gaze drawn by an invisible, irresistible force. Prince Rhys had stopped, his attention fixed, not on Director Valerius, not on the assembled Synarchs, but on him, on subject 7:34. Their eyes met. The prince's eyes were the source of the color, the impossible blue-gold light that was now flooding Kalen's entire being. And in their depths, he saw not the cold assessment of an enemy, but a look of profound, staggering recognition, a shock that mirrored his own, a question, a name he had never heard but somehow knew. The prince's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. The word, however, struck Kalen with the force of a physical blow, a whisper that was not sound but pure meaning, broadcast directly into the core of his mind. You. Kalen's knees threatened to buckle. The world tilted, the sterile white room dissolving into a swirl of light and shadow. He gripped the edge of the director's chair, his knuckles white. From his side, he felt a wave of cold, sharp displeasure from Valerius. The director had noticed. The anomaly had been logged. The experiment had just become infinitely more interesting and infinitely more dangerous. The retreat from the summit chamber was a blur of controlled motion, a disorienting slide back into the familiar, sterile silence of the directorate's inner sanctums. Kalen moved on autopilot, his body executing the precise, conditioned movements of returning to his cell. But his mind was a maelstrom. The echo of that single word, you, reverberated through him, a resonant frequency that threatened to shake his entire being apart. The sensory onslaught from the prince had receded, but its ghost remained, a phantom limb of feeling he could not ignore. The scent of ozone and rain still clung to the edges of his awareness, a stark, living contrast to the antiseptic air of the corridors. The memory of those blue-gold eyes was burned into his mind's eye, a vibrant wound in his monochrome world. He was an instrument that had been struck, and he could not stop vibrating. Back in his chamber, the invisible door sealed shut, and the pressure of the silence returned, heavier than before. It no longer felt like a cradle. It felt like a tomb. He stood in the center of the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, a gesture of tension so alien he barely recognized it as his own. His heart was still beating too fast. His skin felt too sensitive. He was compromised. He was contaminated. The director's voice, when it came, was colder than he had ever heard it. It lacked its usual dispassionate curiosity, replaced by something sharp and brittle, like a sheet of ice cracking under pressure. Report. Subject 734. The anomaly. Kalen struggled to form the words, to translate the cataclysmic event into the cold, clinical language of the directorate. Unforeseen empathic resonance with the Ethelgard primary. High-level sensory feedback. My internal systems were overwhelmed. It was a gross understatement. It was like calling a supernova a flicker of light. Define resonance, Valerius's voice demanded, sharp as a scalpel. A bidirectional signal, involuntary. It bypassed standard protocols. It felt primal. He chose the word carefully. It was a word from the Ethelgard lexicon, a word that acknowledged the existence of instinct, of something beyond logic and control. It was a word Valerius would despise. There was a long silence. Kalen could feel the director's focus on him, a palpable, analytical pressure. Valerius was not in the room, but his consciousness was a constant, oppressive presence. He was studying the data Kalen represented, searching for the flaw in the code. The dampeners were at minimal tolerance, the director stated, as if convincing himself. This is a variable that must be eliminated. Prepare for recalibration. Kalen's blood ran cold. Recalibration. It was a euphemism, a sterile term for a process of profound violence. It was a forced psychic purge, a high-frequency neural scouring designed to wipe away any aberrant thoughts or emotional residue. It was agony. It was the ultimate expression of the director's control, a reminder that even his mind was not his own. A panel in the ceiling slid open, and a cluster of gleaming metallic arms descended, tipped with fiber optic filaments that pulsed with a faint, chilling light. He knew what to do. He knelt, then lay flat on the floor, spine straight, arms at his sides, offering himself up to the machine. It was a posture of absolute submission. He was an asset being serviced. He was an instrument being retuned. As the filaments made contact with his temples, his neck, his spine, he closed his eyes. The memory of the prince's gaze was there, waiting for him in the darkness. He had to let it go. He had to purge the color, the scent, the sound. He had to return to the clean, empty silence. But for the first time in his life, a part of him refused. A small, defiant spark in the core of his being clung to the memory, shielding it, protecting it. The recalibration began. A jolt of energy, cold and sharp, shot through his nervous system. His muscles seized. A silent scream ripped through his mind, a scream no one could hear. The machine worked with brutal efficiency, flooding his neural pathways with white noise, erasing, scrubbing, purifying. It sought the anomaly, the foreign data signature of the prince, and attempted to delete it. And Kalen, in a desperate, instinctive act of self-preservation he did not understand, fought back. He wrapped his consciousness around the memory of blue-gold eyes, hid the scent of rain in the deepest corners of his mind, and held on. The pain was immense, a universe of fire and ice. It was the feeling of being torn in two. One part of him, the conditioned part, the subject, craved the release, the return to the peace of nothingness. The other part, the new and terrifying part that had been born in that moment of connection, refused to die. The process seemed to last an eternity. When it was over, the arms retracted, and he was left trembling on the cold floor, slick with a sweat he hadn't realized had formed. The silence returned, but it was different. It was a fragile, ringing silence, the kind that follows a massive explosion. He felt scoured, raw, but not empty. Deep within him, bruised but intact, the memory survived. A single defiant point of light in the vast, enforced darkness. He had resisted. The thought was terrifying. It was a deviation from his core programming. It was a rebellion. He had kept a secret from the director. He was no longer a perfect lens. He was cracked. Miles away, in the opulent but temporary quarters assigned to the Ethelgard delegation, Prince Rhys slammed a fist against a marble table. The stone shuddered, a fine web of cracks appearing on its polished surface. His guards flinched, but said nothing. They had never seen their prince so undone. It was him, Rhys growled, pacing the room like a caged wolf. His second in command, a stoic, grey-haired general named Kalen, watched him with concern. "Your Highness?" Rhys whirled around, his blue-gold eyes blazing with a feverish light. "The Anam Cara, the soulmate, the one the ancient texts speak of. I found him." Kalen's stern expression softened with disbelief. "My prince, the legends are just that, stories to bolster morale." "It is not a story," Rhys snapped, his voice raw with a pain that was not his own. He pressed a hand to his temple, a phantom ache echoing the agony Kalen was enduring miles away. "I felt it. I felt him. And they have him, Kalen. The Synarchs. They hold him captive. They use him as a thing, a tool. He remembered the brief, shattering moment of their gaze. He had seen past the pale, impassive face and the grey tunic. He had seen a soul trapped behind layers of ice, a spirit of immense power and profound loneliness crying out in silence. And in that same instant, he had felt the cold, proprietary presence of the one who held the leash. Director Valerius. "They're hurting him," Rhys whispered, the realization dawning with sickening certainty. He could feel the distant, sharp echo of the recalibration, a spike of agony on the thread of connection that now bound them together. It was faint, muted by distance and the Synarch's technology, but it was undeniably there. A cry for help that had no voice. His political mission, the delicate negotiations of the treaty, all of it evaporated from his mind, replaced by a single, overriding imperative. He had to get him back. He was not a political asset to be captured or a strategic advantage to be won. He was the other half of Rhys's own soul, and he was in the hands of monsters who saw him as nothing more than a machine. "The treaty is no longer the priority," Rhys said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "Our mission has changed. Gather all the intelligence we have on the Directorate's central tower. Security protocols, structural weaknesses, personnel locations. Everything." Kaelin's eyes widened. "Highness, you can't be considering a direct assault. It would be suicide. It would mean war." "It already is a war," Rhys countered, his gaze distant, focused on something only he could see. "They have declared it by taking him, by turning him into a slave." He looked at his second in command, his expression pleading, desperate. "They are trying to erase him, Kaelin, to hollow him out. And I think a part of me will die with him if they succeed." The days that followed the recalibration settled into a new, terrifying rhythm. On the surface, nothing had changed. The white room, the nutrient paste, the silent protectors, the machinery of Kaelin's life continued its inexorable grind. But beneath the surface, everything was different. He was no longer alone in the silence. The connection, the resonance Valerius had tried to sever, persisted. It was a faint, shimmering thread woven through the fabric of his consciousness, a ghost of a presence that was a constant, secret companion. He learned to hide it, to shield it from the Director's passive scans, burying it deep beneath layers of meditative calm. It was his only possession, this fragile link to the Prince, and he guarded it with a ferocity he hadn't known he possessed. At night, when the lumen panels dimmed to a low, twilight grey, and the Directorate's surveillance was at its most automated, the connection would strengthen. It was not a conversation of words. It was a communion of feeling, of fragmented images and raw sensation. He would feel a surge of Rhys's frustration, a sharp, metallic taste of anger directed at his political advisors. He would see flashes of the Ethelgard world through Rhys's eyes, a sky crowded with two moons, the rich, dark soil of a forest floor, the gleam of firelight on the faces of his people. These sensory fragments were a lifeline, whispers of a world beyond his white walls, a world of texture, of warmth, of life. In return, Rhys felt Kaelin's existence. He felt the profound, aching emptiness of his sensory deprivation, the constant, low-level chill of the recycled air, the crushing weight of the silence. It fueled his desperation, hardening his resolve into a sharp, dangerous point. He had to get him out. One night, as Kaelin drifted in the state between meditation and sleep, He felt a deliberate, focused pulse along the thread of connection. It was different from the usual passive flow of emotion. It was intentional. A call. He focused his own awareness, reaching back with a tentative tendril of thought. "Can you hear me?" The thought wasn't his, but it bloomed in his mind, clear and distinct. It was Reese's mental voice, a low, resonant timbre that matched the sound he had imagined. Kalen's breath caught. He had never initiated contact, never dared. He had only listened. To respond was to admit the connection existed, to risk discovery. But the call was filled with such urgency, such desperate hope. He had to answer. He didn't know how to form words in the same way. His mind had been conditioned for reception, not transmission. So he sent back not a word, but a feeling. The feeling of recognition. The feeling of the blue-gold light he saw when he thought of Reese. A wave of profound relief washed over him from the other end of the connection. "I knew it. I knew you were there. They didn't break you." A pause, then a new thought, laced with a cold, hard fury. "What have they done to you?" Kalen couldn't answer that. The question was too vast. What had they not done? Instead, he sent an image, the clearest one he could form. The white, seamless walls of his chamber, stretching into infinity. The cage. The response was a surge of protective rage, so potent it made Kalen flinch. "Not for long. I swear it. I will get you out." The promise was an impossible dream, a fantasy that had no place in his world of calculated probabilities. Escape was a statistical impossibility. No one left the directorate's inner sanctum unless it was to the reclamation facility. Yet hearing the promise, feeling the absolute conviction behind it, Kalen felt a flicker of something he had only ever observed in others. Hope. It was a dangerous, painful emotion. It was the antithesis of acceptance, and it was taking root in the barren soil of his heart. The next day, the director's voice summoned him once more. "Subject 734. The anomaly you represent has been re-evaluated. Its potential as a liability is exceeded by its potential as an asset." Kalen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He knew what was coming. "The resonance is a conduit," Valerius continued, his voice smooth with the pleasure of a new, elegant hypothesis. "A direct, unfiltered channel into the mind of the Ethelgard primary. You will no longer resist it. You will cultivate it. You will become our ear inside the enemy's command. They were going to weaponize the connection. They were going to turn the one beautiful, secret thing in his life into another tool of espionage, another function of the machine. The thought was nauseating. You will initiate contact under controlled conditions. We will monitor. We will record. We will analyze. You will open his mind to us, Subject 734. You will show us his plans, his fears, his strategies." He was being ordered to betray the only person who had ever truly seen him. He was being ordered to desecrate his sanctuary. He was to be a Judas, not by choice, but by design. He was brought to a different chamber this time, a laboratory. In the center was a chair, not a simple slab, but a complex throne of metal and wires. A neuro-interface cradle curved over the headrest, bristling with sensors. This was where the director conducted his most invasive experiments. The protectors strapped him into the chair. The cold metal clasped his wrists, his ankles, his chest. The neuro-cradle lowered, its sensors pressing against his skull. He was pinned, helpless, an insect under a microscope. Valerius was there in person this time, a rare occurrence. He stood behind a translucent screen, his tall, slender silhouette observing Kalen's form. His presence was a suffocating blanket of cold intellect. "The prince is in a strategy session concerning the disputed territories," Valerius said, his voice amplified in the sterile room. "He believes he is unobserved. He is emotional, volatile. His mental shields will be compromised. A perfect opportunity. Now, Subject 734, reach for him." The machine hummed to life. A low-frequency wave pulsed through Kalen's brain, designed to amplify his psychic abilities, to boost the signal. It felt like his skull was being filled with buzzing hornets. He had no choice. To refuse was to be recalibrated into oblivion. But as he extended his consciousness, as he reached for that familiar, vibrant thread of connection, he made a decision. He would obey the letter of the command, but not its spirit. He would open the channel, but he would control the flow of information. He found Rhys easily. The prince's mind was a tempest of frustration and strategic calculations. Kalen could feel his anger at the Synarch's intransigence, his worry for his people, and beneath it all, a constant, aching current of concern for Kalen himself. "Rhys," he projected, a soft, cautious whisper in the storm of the prince's thoughts. Rhys's consciousness snapped to attention. The storm stilled, his focus narrowing to a single point. "Kalen, what is it? Are you all right?" Before Kalen could answer, Valerius's voice cut through the lab. "We have a connection. Data stream is active. Excellent." Kalen felt the director's cold, probing consciousness sliding along the link he had created, a serpent slithering into his sanctuary. He had to warn Rhys. He sent a single, sharp pulse of feeling. Danger, deception, a warning klaxon of pure emotion. He then layered a surface thought over it, a piece of bait for Valerius. He projected an image of a star chart, a tactical display Rhys was studying, letting the director's senses feast on the mundane intelligence. In his mind, Rhys understood instantly. The game had changed. This was no longer a private communion. It was a battlefield. "I understand," Rhys sent back, his mental voice now carefully guarded, layered. "They are watching, listening." A cold smile touched Valerius's lips, visible even as a silhouette. "He is discussing fleet deployments. His strategy is crude, relying on brute force, predictable." Valerius was only seeing what Rhys was now intentionally projecting, a surface layer of false strategy, a performance for their unseen audience. Beneath that layer, hidden in the subcurrents of pure emotion that Valerius's machines couldn't quantify, they continued their silent, desperate conversation. "They are using you," Rhys sent, his fury a tightly controlled ember. "I know," Kalen replied, the thought laced with a profound weariness. "This is what I am. A tool." "No." Rhys's response was fierce, a shield against Kalen's despair. "You are not. Listen to me. We can use this. We can feed them what we want them to see. And we can plan." And so began their dangerous dance. Under the watchful eye of Director Valerius, they built a conspiracy of the mind. While Kalen fed the Directorate useless or misleading tactical data, Rhys fed Kalen the truth of the world. He showed him memories of his childhood, of learning to ride a winged beast called a griffin, of the chaotic, loving warmth of his family. He showed Kalen what it meant to be free, to choose, to love. Each session was a risk. Each session was a torture. Kalen had to endure the physical strain of the amplifier machine and the mental gymnastics of maintaining a dual-stream communication. But each session was also a revelation. He was learning, growing, changing. The white walls of his world were becoming translucent, and he was beginning to see the vibrant colors of the universe that lay beyond. He was no longer just an asset. He was becoming a person, and that made him the most dangerous anomaly the Synarch Directorate had ever created. The forced sessions in the neuro-interface chair became the new axis around which Kalen's existence revolved. Each one was a harrowing performance, a high-wire act of deception played out on a psychic stage. He would sit, strapped and helpless, while Valerius's machines drank in the fabricated intelligence he and Reese carefully constructed. The director grew confident, even arrogant, believing he held the prince's mind in the palm of his hand. He praised Kalen for his efficiency, his seamless integration with the technology. "Your function has been optimized, Subject 734, he once remarked, his voice holding the satisfaction of an engineer whose machine was performing perfectly to specification. "The anomaly has been successfully weaponized." Kalen received the praise with the same outward passivity as he received everything else, but inside, a cold, defiant anger was beginning to coalesce. He was not a weapon. He was not a function. The words Reese sent him during their hidden conversations were taking root, rewriting his core programming. "You have a name," Reese had told him, the thought gentle but insistent. "Before they took you, you had a name." This was a concept Kalen had never considered. He was Subject 734. Before that, he was Subject 734 in a smaller body. His existence had begun with the Directorate. To suggest a before was like suggesting the universe existed before the Big Bang. It was a logical impossibility. "They lie about everything," Reese had insisted, his mental voice laced with a conviction that was hard to dismiss. "The Synarchs promise order, but they built it on a foundation of stolen lives and erased histories. They didn't save the world from chaos. They orchestrated the chaos and then presented themselves as the only solution." During one particularly grueling session, when Valerius was distracted by a data stream showing a fictitious Ethelgard fleet movement, Reese took a greater risk. He didn't just speak to Kalen, he showed him. A memory, raw and unfiltered, flooded the connection. It was not Reese's own memory, but something older, pulled from the deepest, most secure archives of the Imperium. It was a recording, grainy and chaotic, from the time of the Unification Wars, the very conflict the Synarchs claimed to have ended. Kalen saw fire and smoke, cities reduced to rubble. But it was not the random chaos of history books. It was precise, methodical destruction, and at the center of it, he saw figures in grey, their faces impassive, directing unseen forces. He saw people, families, clutching each other as their minds were torn apart by psychic assaults, their emotions turned into weapons against them. He saw the first generation of subjects, children with terrified eyes, being led away in chains, and then Reese showed him a specific data file, a list of abducted children classified by the Imperium as casualties of war. He saw their names, their birth worlds, their genetic markers. Reese guided Kalen's focus to one entry. Entry 734. Name, Elian. Origin, Cygnus X1 colony. Status, deceased. Elian. The name felt strange and familiar at once, like a word from a forgotten dream. It resonated in a place deep inside him that the Directorate had never managed to touch. Reese then showed him a grainy image attached to the file. A small boy with wide, serious eyes and a shock of dark hair. His own eyes. His own hair. The truth hit him not as a thought, but as a physical blow. The world, his meticulously constructed reality, shattered into a million pieces. He was not Subject 734. He was alien. He was not an asset created in a lab. He was a person, stolen from a family, a life. He was not a function. He was a victim. The shock was so profound that for a moment the mask of his passivity slipped. A choked gasp escaped his lips. In the observation room, Valerius looked up from his console, his sharp eyes narrowing. Report. What was that? The neuro-interface cradle amplified the psychic backlash of Kalen's, of Elian's, revelation. Alarms blared, red lights flashing across the sterile laboratory. Massive biofeedback, synaptic overload, a technician cried out. Valerius's voice was ice. Sever the connection, now. A jolt of agonizing energy severed the link to Reese, throwing Elian back into the solitary confinement of his own mind. But his mind was no longer the same space. It was a ruin, the foundations of his identity obliterated. He was not who he thought he was. His entire life was a lie. He was Elian. He was Elian. He was Elian. The name became a mantra, a shield against the screaming chaos in his head. The protectors unstrapped him from the chair, their movements rough, efficient. He was malfunctioning hardware being removed for diagnostics. They dragged him back to his white chamber, and he barely registered the journey. He was adrift in the wreckage of his past. The director's voice filled the cell, devoid of any scientific curiosity now, filled only with cold, sharp-edged fury. You have been compromised. The asset has been contaminated by foreign data. A full system purge is required. A purge, not a recalibration. A purge was a mind wipe. It was the complete erasure of personality, of memory. It was death of the self. They would leave the psychic abilities, the finely honed instrument, but they would delete the ghost that was learning to operate it. They would delete Alien. As the panel in the ceiling opened, revealing the gleaming, terrible arms of the recalibration machine, something inside him broke. The years of conditioning, of passivity, of acceptance, shattered. The quiet desperation he had lived with his whole life ignited into pure, incandescent rage. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a person. And he would not let them kill him. As the machine's filaments descended, he did something he had never done before. He reached out with his mind, not to listen, not to perceive, but to push. He gathered all his pain, his rage, his newfound identity, and focused it into a single, sharp point of psychic force. The filaments, inches from his skin, sparked and shorted out. The arms of the machine seized, then retracted violently into the ceilings with a grinding shriek of tortured metal. A shower of sparks rained down on the white floor. In the control room, Valerius stared at the monitor, his calm facade finally cracking. "Impossible," he whispered. "He's resisting. He's actively using his abilities against the system." Alien got to his feet, his body trembling with the effort, with the sheer, terrifying novelty of defiance. He looked up at the invisible camera he knew was watching him, and for the first time he let his own emotions show on his face. He let Valerius see his hatred. The director's voice returned, tight with control. Containment field to maximum. Sedative gas protocol initiated. The low hum of the chamber's field intensified to a painful, high-pitched whine. A hiss sounded as gas began to pour from vents in the walls. His lungs burned, his head swam. But as his consciousness began to fade, he reached out one last time, with all his remaining strength, along the broken thread of his connection to Reese. He sent no words, no images. He sent only the raw, screaming essence of his newfound name, Elian. And then everything went dark. But across the city, Rhys, reeling from their sudden disconnection, received the message. It struck him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. It was a name. It was a cry. It was a farewell. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that the game was over. The time for subtlety and deception was done. If he didn't act now, Elian would be erased forever. The system's response to his defiance was swift and absolute. Elian awoke not in his familiar white chamber, but in a place of utter darkness and silence, sensory deprivation. It was the Directorate's final, most cruel form of control. Without light, without sound, without touch, the mind would begin to devour itself. They had placed him in the heart of the machine, a place they called the core, reserved for the most volatile and dangerous assets. He floated in a viscous, temperature-neutral fluid, his body suspended in a state of perfect stasis. Tubes supplied him with oxygen and nutrients directly into his bloodstream. He was a brain in a jar, his physical form rendered irrelevant, his consciousness the sole subject of their containment. But they had made a critical miscalculation. They had intended to isolate him, to sever him from all external stimuli, so they could begin the slow, methodical process of a mind wipe. In doing so, they had removed every distraction. In the perfect, silent darkness, with his body a distant, sleeping thing, his mind was sharper, more focused than it had ever been. And the one thing they could not take from him, the one connection they could not sever, was the psychic thread that bound him to Rhys. It was no longer a whisper. In this absolute void, it was a beacon, a vibrant, living line of light in the endless black. Rhys's panic and fury were a constant, roaring fire at the other end of the line, a source of warmth in the profound cold of the core. Elian. Answer me. Elian. Rhys's calls were frantic, a desperate battering against the walls of Elian's consciousness. Elian gathered his focus, pushing past the groggy after-effects of the sedatives. I am here. The relief that flooded the connection was so potent it was almost painful. They tried to purge you. They failed, Elian sent back, a new, hard strength in his mental voice. They showed me who I am. And now I will show them. A plan began to form in the space between them, a desperate gambit woven from Rhys's military strategy and Elian's intimate knowledge of the Directorate's systems. Rhys would not launch a full-scale invasion. That would be a slaughter. Instead, he would stage a surgical strike, a feint designed to draw the majority of the Directorate's security forces to the upper levels of the Central Tower during the formal signing of the now meaningless peace treaty. The chaos would be a cover. While the protectors were occupied, a small elite team would breach the lower levels, heading for the core. But they would be moving blind. The core's schematics were the Directorate's most closely guarded secret. I can guide you, Elian offered. From in here, I can feel the entire building, the power conduits, the security patrols, the life support systems. I am connected to it all. He was the ghost in their machine. They had plugged him into the heart of their fortress, and in doing so, had given him the keys to its destruction. It's too dangerous, Rhys argued, his concern a palpable warmth. If they detect you, they'll shut you down. They'll kill you. They are going to kill me anyway, Elian replied, his thought clear and cold as ice. I choose to die fighting. I choose to die as Elian. There was a pause, a moment of silent communion. Rhys was sending him feelings of strength, of courage, of a fierce, possessive love that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Ilian, who had never been touched with affection in his life, drank it in like a man dying of thirst. The day of the treaty signing arrived. From his suspended prison, Ilian could feel the hum of activity in the tower above. The gathering of dignitaries, the heightened state of alert, the cold, focused mind of Director Valerius presiding over the ceremony in the summit chamber. Ilian began his work. Gently, tentatively, he extended his consciousness, not as a probe, but as a part of the system itself. He brushed against the tower's central computer, not hacking it, but coaxing it. He was a whisper in its code, a phantom signal that was indistinguishable from its own internal processes. He started small, a flickering lumen panel in a deserted corridor, a temperature drop of 0.5 degrees in a records office, a door that took a fraction of a second too long to open. He was testing the boundaries, learning the feel of the network, mapping its pathways. He was a virus, and the system did not even know it was infected. Then he felt the arrival of Reese's strike team, a faint tremor in the tower's foundation as they used a sonic charge to breach a subterranean maintenance tunnel. Their minds were shielded, disciplined, but he could feel the radiating confidence of their leader. Reese was with them. He was not directing from a war room. He was here, risking everything. A surge of emotion, sharp and overwhelming, shot through Ilian. It was fear, not for himself, but for Reese. He ruthlessly suppressed it. Emotion was a liability now. He needed to be as cold and precise as the machine he was fighting. "I see you," he sent to Reese, his mental voice a calm, steady beacon. "Proceed 200 meters, corridor Gamma 7. There is a 2-man patrol approaching. They will reach the intersection in 40 seconds. He watched in his mind's eye as Reese's team moved with silent, deadly efficiency, neutralizing the patrol before they could raise an alarm. Ilian became their eyes and ears. He diverted security cameras, created false sensor readings, unlocked doors seconds before they reached them, and locked them seconds after they passed. He wove a path for them through the labyrinthine depths of the Directorate, a path of shadows and silence. Above them, chaos erupted. The feint had begun. Explosions rocked the upper levels of the tower, carefully placed charges designed to cause panic and structural damage without mass casualties. Alarms blared. The cold, ordered hum of the tower was replaced by the discordant symphony of crisis. Ilian could feel the wave of panic from the civilians, the disciplined response of the protectors as they moved to contain the threat. He felt Valerius's mind, a point of absolute cold fury in the midst of the mayhem, directing the defense, completely unaware of the true attack unfolding deep beneath his feet. The closer Reese got, the more risks Ilian had to take. He triggered a fire suppression system in a key sector, forcing a guard detachment to reroute. He overloaded a power conduit, plunging an entire sublevel into darkness and confusion. Each action sent ripples through the tower's network, and he could feel the system's automated diagnostics beginning to notice the anomalies, searching for the source of the corruption. He was running out of time. "They're getting close to you," Reese sent. His thoughts clipped, focused. Level 12, core security checkpoint, heavy resistance. Ilian focused his attention on the checkpoint. He could feel the minds of the dozen elite protectors stationed there, their readiness, their enhanced senses. Reese's small team could not fight their way through without being delayed, without taking casualties. He had to do something more drastic. He gathered his power, not into a fine point, but into a broad, concussive wave. He reached for the minds of the protectors at the checkpoint, and he pushed. He did not try to kill them or control them. He simply fed them a massive, overwhelming blast of sensory data. The terror in the upper floors, the screech of alarms, the blare of contradictory orders. He overloaded them, short-circuiting their focus. For a critical 10 seconds, they were disoriented, confused, their discipline shattered. It was the opening Rhys needed. Now, Elian screamed into his mind. He felt Rhys and his team storm the checkpoint, the brief, brutal sounds of the fight. And then, they were through. They were at the final door, the entrance to the core. It was sealed with a biometric lock, keyed only to Director Valerius. It was impregnable. "We're stopped," Rhys sent, a note of desperation in his voice. "We can't get through the door." Elian turned his full attention to the lock. He could not fake a biometric signal, but he was connected to the very heart of the tower's power systems. He could not open the door, but perhaps he could remove the door itself. He drew in a deep, mental breath, pulling on the energy of the tower's fusion core, a reservoir of immense power. The fluid in his suspension tank began to heat up. The monitors tracking his life signs would be screaming, but he hoped no one was left to watch them. He focused all of that energy, all of his will, all of his rage at the mechanisms of the door, the magnetic seals, the titanium bolts, the power relays. He did not just push, he tore. From the other side, Rhys saw the massive steel door begin to glow cherry red. With a deafening shriek of protesting metal, the locks melted, the bolts vaporized, and the entire door blew inward, landing on the floor of the corridor with a cataclysmic crash. The way was open. Through the smoking doorway, Rhys saw it. The core, a vast, spherical chamber, and in its center, suspended in a glowing amber fluid, was the still, pale form of the man he had come to save. He was a messiah in a tomb, beautiful and terrible, and as Rhys stepped into the chamber, he felt Elian's consciousness, powerful and triumphant, but fading fast. "I am here," Rhys sent, pouring all his love, all his strength into the thought. A faint, weary pulse came in reply. "I know. The breach of the core was the final, critical failure in the Directorate's system of control." As Rhys and his soldiers entered the chamber, the tower's automated defenses recognized the catastrophic intrusion. Red emergency lighting bathed the room in a bloody, pulsing glow. A synthesized voice, devoid of emotion, began a countdown. Containment field compromised. Core sterilization protocol initiated. 2 minutes to total energy release. They were going to detonate the fusion reactor, vaporizing the entire sublevel to prevent the asset from falling into enemy hands. They would sacrifice the heart of their tower to maintain their secrets. "We have to get him out of there," Rhys yelled, his voice echoing in the vast, humming chamber. 2 of his soldiers immediately began working on the stasis pod's release mechanism, their tools sparking against the unfamiliar technology. Rhys moved to the translucent wall of the pod, placing his hand against its cool surface. Inside, Elian's eyes were closed, his face serene, but Rhys could feel the monumental exhaustion radiating from him, the strain of a mind that had single-handedly fought a fortress and won. "Elian, stay with me," he pleaded, sending the thought through their bond. "We're almost there." The reply was faint, fragmented, tired, so tired. The effort of controlling the tower and then blowing the door had pushed him far beyond his limits. His consciousness was flickering like a dying flame. 1 minute, 30 seconds, the computer voice droned. "I can't bypass the sequence," his engineer shouted over the rising whine of the reactor. "The controls are fused." They were trapped. The realization settled with cold, heavy certainty. Rhys looked at Elian's peaceful face, and a strange calm washed over him. He had not come this far to fail. He had not found the other half of his soul only to lose him in fire. He turned to his second in command. "Get the men out. That's an order." "Sir, we won't leave you." "You will," Rhys commanded, his voice ringing with the absolute authority of the Alpha Prince. The mission was to secure the asset. If he cannot be moved, the mission is a failure. Your duty is to survive and report that failure. Go, now. Reluctantly, his soldiers began to retreat, casting worried glances back at their prince. Rhys turned back to the pod, pressing both hands against it, as if he could somehow phase through and pull Elian out with his bare hands. He closed his eyes, focusing his entire being on their connection. "Elian, you have to wake up. You have to help them." He poured all his energy, all his life force into the bond, a desperate psychic transfusion. He felt Elian's consciousness stir, latching onto his strength. A flicker of awareness. An image bloomed in Rhys's mind, sent from Elian. A small maintenance panel near the base of the stasis pod, a cluster of fiber optic cables within. The fluid drain protocol, manual override. Rhys relayed the information instantly. "There, that panel. Override the drain protocol." The engineer, who had hesitated at the doorway, rushed back, prying the panel open. 1 minute. The whine of the reactor was becoming a physical pressure, making the air vibrate. The soldier's hands flew, connecting a bypass device. "It's working. The fluid is draining." Inside the pod, the amber liquid began to recede. Elian's body, no longer buoyant, slumped against the curved wall. His eyes fluttered open. For the first time, they saw each other without a screen, without a psychic link, without the barrier of politics and war. They were just two people in a room that was about to be consumed by fire. Elian's gaze was weak but clear. He saw the panic, the desperation, and the fierce, unwavering love in Rhys's eyes. 30 seconds. The pod door hissed open. Rhys didn't hesitate. He reached in, uncoupling the nutrient and oxygen tubes with a practiced efficiency he didn't know he had. He gathered Elian's limp, shockingly light body into his arms. Elian was cold, his skin clammy, but he was real. He was solid. The thin grey tunic he wore was soaked. Rhys pulled him from the pod just as the last of his soldiers laid down covering fire at the far end of the corridor, holding back the approaching protectors. He threw Elian over his shoulder and ran. 15 seconds. They sprinted down the corridor, the heat from the core chamber searing the air behind them. The concussive blasts of their pursuers' weapons impacted the walls around them. 10, 9, 8. They rounded a corner, diving through a blast door just as Rhys's engineers slammed the emergency seal. A moment later, a wave of incandescent white light and silent, crushing force slammed against the other side of the door, making the entire structure groan. The core had detonated. They had made it, but the fight was not over. They were still deep inside enemy territory. As they moved through the lower levels, Elian began to stir, his consciousness slowly returning. He was a dead weight on Rhys's shoulder, his breathing shallow. "Valerius," Elian whispered in his mind. The thought was sharp, laced with dread. "He's coming." Elian could feel him. The director having realized the true nature of the attack, was descending from the upper levels, his mind a cold, focused vortex of rage. He was not coming with an army of protectors. He was coming alone. He was coming for his property. They reached the rendezvous point, a cavernous hangar bay where a stealth shuttle was waiting. The ramp was down, its engines whining softly. Freedom was meters away. And then he was there. Director Valerius stood at the far end of the hangar, silhouetted against the harsh lighting. He was no longer the calm, collected scientist. His immaculate uniform was disheveled, a thin trickle of blood running from his temple where falling debris had struck him. But his eyes were terrifyingly sane, burning with an obsessive, proprietary fury. He held a small, sleek pistol, but he did not raise it. The weapon was not for Reese. "Subject 734, Valerius said, his voice dangerously soft, echoing in the hangar. "You are a failed experiment, flawed, contaminated. You have forgotten your purpose." Reese gently lowered Elian to the ground, shielding him with his own body as he drew his sidearm. "Stay back," he warned. Valerius ignored him completely, his eyes locked on Elian. "I created you. Every thought you have is a product of my design. Every breath you take is by my permission. You have no self. You have no name. You are nothing but a collection of functions. And you are malfunctioning." He was trying to reassert control, using the trigger words and psychological anchors of Elian's conditioning. Elian could feel the old programming trying to surface, the ingrained instinct to obey, to submit. He gritted his teeth, leaning against Reese for support. "He's wrong," Reese sent, a fierce, protective wall around Elian's mind. "You are Elian. You are free. You think this primal," Valerius spat the word like a curse. "This emotional creature can offer you anything. It is a cage of flesh and instinct. I offered you the purity of purpose, of logic. You have thrown it away for an illusion." "He's not an illusion," Elian said, his voice raspy, raw from disuse, but steady. It was the first time he had spoken aloud in years. The sound of his own voice was a revelation. "He's real. I'm real." Valerius's face contorted in a mask of bitter disappointment. It was the look of a god whose creation had defied him. "If I cannot have you, then no one will. All failed experiments must be decommissioned." He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at Elian's head. There was no time to think. Reese fired first. His shot was true, striking Valerius in the shoulder, spinning him around. But Valerius was already firing, a reflexive, dying act of spite. The shot went wide of Reese, but struck the control panel for the hangar's massive blast doors. Sparks flew. With a groaning shriek, the doors began to close. Reese didn't hesitate. He scooped Elian up again and ran for the shuttle. They scrambled up the ramp just as it began to rise, the heavy blast doors sealing shut behind them, plunging the hangar into darkness and sealing Valerius inside his collapsing temple. The shuttle's engines roared, and with a powerful thrust, it shot out of the tower and into the polluted skies of the Synarch capital. Reese laid Elian down gently on the deck, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were out. They were free. The ascent from the grey, choked skies of the Synarch capital was a violent, shuddering climb. The shuttle, a repurposed Ethelgard scout ship, rattled as it punched through the dense upper atmosphere, and escaping the last vestiges of the Directorate's control. Reese knelt beside Elian, his hands hovering, unsure of where to touch, as if this fragile, breathing reality might shatter if he was not careful. Elian's eyes were open, staring up at the metal ceiling of the cockpit, but his gaze was distant, unfocused. He was processing a lifetime of sensory deprivation, giving way to a sudden, brutal flood of new experiences. The vibration of the deck, the roar of the engines, the scent of ozone and hot metal, the physical weight of Reese's presence beside him. It was an avalanche. Reese took off his heavy tactical jacket and gently draped it over Elian's thin frame. The grey tunic was flimsy, inadequate. The simple act of providing warmth felt monumental. As the ship cleared the smog layer, the pilot's voice came over the internal comm, calm and professional. "We're clear, Your Highness. Setting course for the rendezvous point." Reese didn't take his eyes off Elian. He reached out, his movement slow, deliberate, and brushed a stray strand of dark hair from Elian's forehead. The touch was electric. Elian flinched, his whole body tensing, a conditioned response to unexpected physical contact. But he didn't pull away. After a moment, he leaned into the touch, just a fraction, a silent surrender. The gesture was so small, yet it spoke volumes. It was trust. It was acceptance. Reese's heart ached with a tenderness so fierce it was almost painful. He let his hand rest on Elian's hair, a grounding, steady pressure. He could feel the fine tremor running through Elian's body, the aftershocks of trauma and exertion. The psychic bond between them was calm now, a quiet, flowing river after the raging storm. It was no longer a channel for desperate messages and strategic plans, but a space of shared feeling, of mutual comfort. He could feel Elian's confusion, his fear, but also a nascent, fragile curiosity. "Look," Reese sent gently, not wanting to startle him with his voice. He gestured toward the main viewport. Elian turned his head slowly, his movements stiff. He followed Reese's gaze, and he saw it. For the first time in his life, he saw the sky, not a simulation on a lumen panel, not a concept from a data file, but the real, true sky. It was a vast, impossible expanse of the deepest indigo, a velvet darkness so profound it seemed to have depth and texture, and scattered across it were the stars. They weren't the cold, distant points of light he had imagined. They were a riot of color, diamond white, sapphire blue, ruby red, blazing with a fire that felt ancient and alive. A nebula bloomed in the distance, a delicate cosmic flower of pink and violet gas. A gasp, soft and full of wonder, escaped Elian's lips. His eyes, wide and luminous, reflected the star field, as if he held entire galaxies within them. The sight stole Reese's breath. He was witnessing a soul's first sunrise. Elian slowly sat up, pulling Reese's jacket tighter around himself. He crawled toward the viewport, pressing his hands and forehead against the cool, transparent steel, trying to get closer, to absorb the sheer, overwhelming beauty of it all. He was free. The words echoed in his mind, but the concept was too large to grasp. Freedom wasn't an abstract idea. It was this. It was the coldness of the glass against his skin, the infinite space before his eyes, the steady, reassuring presence of Reese behind him. It was the ache in his muscles and the rasp in his throat. It was the sudden, sharp sting of tears in his eyes, an emotional response his dampeners had suppressed for a lifetime. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He reached up and touched it with a sense of wonder, examining the moisture on his fingertip. He had observed this phenomenon in others, logged it as saline secretion due to extreme emotional distress or joy. He had never experienced it. He wasn't sure which category this fell into. Perhaps both. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his own voice still a foreign sound. "Yes," Reese said, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't looking at the stars. He was looking at Elian. They stayed like that for a long time, in a comfortable, shared silence, as the ship put more and more distance between them and the world that had been Elian's prison. The future was a vast, unknown territory. Elian was a man without a past, a stranger to the most basic human experiences. He would have to learn everything from scratch: how to eat food with flavor, how to walk on grass, how to speak to people without filtering their every emotion, how to be a person instead of an instrument. The scars of his upbringing ran deep. They would not vanish overnight. Reese knew this. He knew his journey with Elian was only just beginning. There would be nightmares, moments of panic, a long and difficult road to healing. The Aethelgard Imperium, with its complex politics and rigid traditions, would not be an easy place for someone like Elian to navigate. There would be those who saw him as a weapon, just as Valerius had, and those who would fear his power. But as he watched Elian trace the path of a distant comet with his finger, a quiet, determined resolve settled in Reese's heart. He would be his shield. He would be his teacher. He would be his anchor in this new, overwhelming world. He would give him the time and space he needed to find himself, to decide who he wanted to be. After a while, Elian turned away from the viewport, his gaze finally settling on Reese. The look in his eyes was clear, direct, and held a question. It was a question about the future, about what came next, about what this powerful, undeniable bond between them truly meant. Reese offered no easy answers, no grand declarations. The time for that would come later. Instead, he simply held out his hand, palm up, an invitation, an offering, not a command, a choice. Elian looked down at the offered hand. It was a strong hand, calloused from holding a sword and a ship's controls, but it was offered with a gentleness that spoke of immense restraint. For his entire life, every touch he had known had been clinical, invasive, or violent. This was something else entirely. This was a beginning. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and placed his hand in Reese's. His fingers were long and slender, pale against Reese's sun-darkened skin. As their hands clasped, a quiet warmth spread through the connection, a feeling of rightness, of coming home. It was not a cataclysmic shock like their first meeting, but a soft, steady hum of two souls finally at peace, finally in their proper place. He was not an asset. He was not a subject. He was Elian. And his destiny was not to be a tool for his enemy, but to hold the hand of the man who had crossed galaxies to find him. The ship moved on, a tiny spark of light and hope against the infinite, star-dusted dark, carrying them toward the uncertain dawn of their new life.